She's healthy, but she can't play. That single sentence has now set the entire basketball internet on fire, because just hours after the Indiana Fever officially ruled Caitlin Clark out of the lineup, the explanation that followed has left fans more confused, more frustrated, and more divided than ever before. On one hand, the head coach is saying there's nothing serious going on. No long-term concern, no major setback, just caution, stiffness, and routine management. But on the other hand, the timing of everything is what's making this explode. A star player dealing with a manageable issue suddenly goes from questionable to out right before tip-off, after a stretch of heavy minutes and intense game load. And now fans are asking the question nobody can ignore anymore. How can someone be healthy but still not available to play? That contradiction alone is fueling thousands of debates across social media, with clips being replayed, press conference answers being dissected, and every word from the coaching staff being analyzed like evidence in a courtroom. But that's not even the most controversial part, because the real anger from fans isn't just about the injury update. It's about trust. Fans who bought tickets, fans who traveled, fans who expected to see Caitlin Clark on the floor, only to find out at the last possible moment that she wouldn't be playing. And now the situation has spiraled into something much bigger than basketball. It's become about communication. It's become about accountability. And for some fans, it's become about whether it's or the story they're being told even adds up anymore. Because when healthy and unavailable are being used in the same breath, people start wondering what's really going on behind the scenes. And the answer might be more complicated than anyone expected. To understand why this healthy but unavailable moment has blown up the way it has, you have to step back from the headline and look at the environment it's coming from. Because this isn't just about one press conference answer. It's about a season where every detail around Caitlin Clark and the Indiana Fever is being magnified in real time, where routine coaching language gets interpreted like hidden meaning, and where injury updates are no longer just medical notes. They're public events. Caitlin Clark didn't enter the WNBA quietly. She arrived with a spotlight that followed her from college, through draft night, and straight into every arena she stepped into as a professional. That kind of attention doesn't fade after tip-off. It lingers on every substitution, every timeout, every post-game comment. And over time, that attention changes how everything is perceived. A normal injury update becomes a debate. A rest decision becomes a controversy. A coach's press conference becomes a source of contradiction analysis. That's the space this situation is sitting in right now. The Indiana Fever, meanwhile, are operating under one of the most intense visibility environments in the league. Every decision is instantly broadcast, clipped, reposted, and reinterpreted across platforms that reward emotion and speed over context. In that environment, clarity gets replaced by fragments. A short answer from a coach, a clipped press conference line, a single word like stiffness or cautious, and those fragments get pulled apart, studied, and reassembled into narratives that often grow far beyond their original meaning. So when fans hear, "she's healthy" in one moment, and "she's out due to injury management" in another, the gap between those phrases becomes the entire story. Not necessarily because there is a contradiction in a clinical sense, but because in public, communication, tone, and timing matter just as much as technical accuracy. And that's where the tension starts building. Because fans aren't just consuming updates anymore. They're trying to reconcile them. They're asking, why did she play heavy minutes in one game? Why did she sit in the next? Why are updates shifting so quickly? Why does availability feel uncertain so often? And those questions don't stay quiet for long. They spread. They turn into threads. They turn into breakdown videos. They turn into emotional debates between supporters and critics of the coaching staff. At the same time, the broader context of modern sports media makes everything more intense. Player availability is no longer just a locker room topic. It's tied to ticket sales, broadcast expectations, fantasy leagues, and fan travel decisions. So when a star player is ruled out late, even for legitimate caution, the impact is immediate and visible. Fans don't just feel disappointed, they feel misinformed, and that feeling is what fuels the reaction cycle. Because once trust becomes part of the conversation, everything else gets filtered through it. A routine update becomes suspicious. A cautious decision becomes questionable. A coach's explanation becomes something to decode rather than accept at face value. And in this case, the timing of the announcement is what pushed everything into overdrive. Late injury decisions always create frustration in professional sports, but when they involve a player of Clark's magnitude, that frustration multiplies. People don't just feel like a game changed. They feel like expectations were reshaped without enough warning. That emotional response is powerful because it connects directly to the experience of fans who planned their time, their money, and their expectations around seeing a specific player perform. And when that doesn't happen, especially after ambiguous messaging, the reaction isn't just disappointment, it's questioning. From there, the conversation expands quickly. Coaching decisions get re-examined. Rotation patterns get revisited. Past press conference comments get replayed with new context. Even small phrases start being treated as signals rather than routine language. And once that happens, every new update becomes part of a larger ongoing narrative rather than a standalone event. That's the environment this situation is sitting in right now. Not just a team managing player health, but a system where communication, expectation, and interpretation are constantly colliding. And when those three things don't align clearly, even a simple update like healthy but unavailable stops as being simple at all and starts becoming the center of an entirely new wave of questions that fans are already trying to answer before the next game even begins. The moment the update hit that Caitlin Clark was out, the conversation didn't stay focused on injury management for very long. It shifted fast because fans didn't just hear she's unavailable. They heard a pattern they thought they recognized. A player dealing with a recurring issue. A workload that seemed inconsistent. A coaching explanation that changed depending on timing and context. And that's where the first major wave of conflict began. Inside hours, social media wasn't talking about just one game anymore. It was pulling together a sequence of events across multiple matchups, trying to build a timeline that made sense of everything. One game where she played heavy minutes. Another where she looked fine but sat unexpectedly. Another where she returned after visible discomfort. And now this latest update, healthy but out. To fans, it didn't feel isolated. It felt connected. Even though officially, each decision had its own explanation, the audience was no longer treating them separately. They were stacking them. And once you stack moments like that, they start forming a shape. Whether or not that shape actually exists, that's where the first twist of perception really hit. The injury stopped being viewed as a singles medical issue, and started being viewed as a management issue. That distinction changed everything. Because medical issues are accepted, management issues are debated, and debated issues become emotional issues. The frustration grew even more when clips from press conferences resurfaced. Not new statements, but older ones. Lines about stiffness, day-to-day evaluation, cautious approach, and we'll monitor her workload. Individually, these are standard phrases in professional sports. But in the current climate, fans began reading them differently. Not as updates, but as inconsistencies. One statement emphasized caution, Another emphasized availability. Another downplayed concern. And then came the healthy but not playing explanation. That gap between language and outcome is what triggered the first real fracture in trust. Because fans weren't just asking what happened. They were asking, Talasark, which version are we supposed to believe? And once that question enters the conversation, everything becomes unstable. Then came the second layer of conflict. Game footage and rotation patterns started circulating again. Not as isolated highlights, but as part of an emerging narrative being built by online commentators. Every sequence was being reinterpreted. A longer than expected stint on the floor became overuse. A substitution became protection. A rest game became evidence of mismanagement. A return game became proof the issue isn't serious. Nothing stayed neutral anymore. Everything became symbolic. And that's when the first major twist fully formed in the public narrative. Talaferred the belief that the issue was not just injury, but inconsistency in how the situation was being handled and communicated. Even though no official statement confirmed any wrongdoing, the perception online had already shifted. And perception is what drives momentum. Once that shift happened, the conversation expanded beyond basketball strategy and into something more emotional. Fans began focusing on responsibility. Who is making the decisions? Who is controlling the messaging? Who is accountable for the timing? And with those questions, the discussion became more heated. Some fans defended the coaching staff, arguing that player health is complex, unpredictable, and not something the public has full access to. They emphasized that medical caution often looks inconsistent from the outside. Others were not convinced. They pointed to timing, late announcements, sudden changes, shifting explanations. To them, it didn't feel like randomness. It felt like lack of clarity. And that difference in interpretation is where the conflict intensified. Then came another turning point. A simple idea started spreading across fan discussions. Twalith Fruck, if she's healthy, why isn't she playing? That question sounds simple, but it carries weight because it forces a binary interpretation of something that is actually non-binary in professional sports. Players can be partially healthy, conditionally available, or limited in minutes, but those nuances don't always survive online discussion. So the conversation collapsed into extremes. She's either fine or not. It's either mismanagement or precaution. It's either normal or suspicious. And nuance disappeared. At the same time, the emotional energy around the team kept building. Fans who had purchased tickets or planned to attend games began sharing frustration about expectations versus reality. Even when understanding injury caution, the timing of updates created a feeling of uncertainty that was hard to ignore. And that feeling fed directly into the narrative cycle. Because uncertainty always creates space for interpretation. And interpretation always creates conflict. By the end of this phase, the situation had evolved far beyond a standard injury update. It had become a debate about communication, consistency, and trust in decision-making. And just when it seemed like the conversation might settle into routine discussion again, a second twist started forming underneath the surface. One that didn't come from the game itself, but from how quickly the narrative around it was escalating online, and how every new detail seemed to deepen the divide instead of closing it. At this point, the situation was no longer being driven by what was happening on the court. It was being driven by what people believed was happening behind it. And that's where everything escalated again. Because once a storyline reaches this level of attention, every new update stops being just information. It becomes confirmation material for whichever side someone already believes in. So when clips of Caitlin Clark's recent minutes load began circulating again, they weren't viewed as neutral game management. They were interpreted as evidence of overuse, evidence of caution, evidence of inconsistency, evidence of something not adding up, even though, in reality, the same data can support multiple interpretations depending on context. But context is exactly what gets lost during escalation cycles. Then came first major reveal moment in the online discussion space. Not an official report, not a confirmed leak, but a viral wave of commentary claiming that the team's approach to Clark's workload had shifted repeatedly in a short span of games. Some users compiled sequences showing heavy minutes in tight games, reduced minutes in others, sudden late injury adjustments, and shifting terminology. In press updates, individually, none of this is unusual in professional basketball. But grouped together without explanation, it starts to feel like a pattern, even if that pattern is not formally established. And that's where escalation becomes self-sustaining, because the more people talk about a pattern, the more the brain starts looking for it. Even in places where it may not actually exist, that's when the second layer of the controversy formed. The belief that communication around the situation was inconsistent enough to create confusion, even if the underlying decisions were medically routine. This is where the narrative splits completely into two worlds. In one world, this is standard load management for a high-usage player dealing with minor recurring discomfort. In the other world, it is a series of decisions that don't feel clearly explained, especially when they affect availability right before games. And both interpretations start reinforcing themselves. Then the discussion shifted again, this time toward timing, because fans began focusing less on the injury itself and more on when updates were being released. Late announcements became the focal point, not because late updates are inherently wrong in sports medicine, but because they directly affect fan expectations. People don't just plan emotionally around players, they plan financially and logistically. Tickets, travel, time, anticipation. So when a star player is ruled out late, the frustration is not purely medical, it becomes experiential. And that's where the emotional pressure increases. Because fans feel like they were prepared for one reality and then given another at the last moment. That feeling spreads quickly online, and once it spreads, it becomes part of the narrative foundation. Then came the next explosive phase of the escalation cycle, reaction amplification. Clips of coaches speaking about stiffness, monitoring, and cautious decisions were replayed and dissected across social platforms. Every phrase was analyzed, not for medical meaning, but for consistency. And consistency became the new standard of judgment. If two statements sounded slightly different, they were treated as contradiction. If timing changed, it was treated as a shift in narrative. Even normal variance in sports communication began to look suspicious under constant scrutiny. And that's when the shocking reveal in the online sense emerged. Not a single confirmed fact, but a growing belief that the situation was not being communicated in a way that satisfied public understanding. And that belief is powerful, because once fans feel unclear, they don't stop at confusion. They start building explanations. Then those explanations turn into arguments. Then those arguments turn into identity-based debates between fan groups. And suddenly, the topic is no longer Caitlin Clark's availability. It is trust in the organization, trust in communication, trust in decision-making, trust in consistency. And once trust becomes the subject, the original basketball issue becomes secondary. At the same time, highlight compilations, minute breakdowns, and commentary videos continued circulating, each adding another layer of interpretation. Some creators emphasized caution and medical responsibility. Others emphasized inconsistency and frustration, and the algorithm boosted both, because both generate engagement, which means the conflict keeps feeding itself. And as it feeds itself, the perception of something bigger happening becomes stronger, even without new official information. That's the core mechanism driving this escalation phase. Till for repetition creates belief. Till for belief creates certainty. Till for certainty creates division. And right now, all three are active at once. So even though nothing officially new has been confirmed, the narrative has already moved forward emotionally. And that's why the conversation didn't slow down after the update. It intensified. Because the real story is no longer just about injury status. It's about why every update feels like it opens more questions instead of closing them. And that is exactly what pushes everything into the next stage of public reaction. Once the escalation phase hit its peak, the conversation stopped being confined to highlights, box scores, or even coaching decisions. It turned into a full-scale reaction cycle across social media, sports media, and fan communities. And every group involved began interpreting the situation through its own lens. And those lenses did not match. That's where the real division began. On one side, a large portion of fans and casual viewers framed the situation as something completely normal in professional sports. They pointed out that injuries fluctuate, stiffness is common, and availability decisions often change rapidly based on how a player responds to treatment or practice load. From their perspective, nothing about this situation required a deeper narrative. It was just basketball, physical strain, game management, routine caution. But on the other side of the conversation, a different interpretation took hold. That group didn't just see injury management. They saw inconsistency. They saw shifting explanations. They saw timing that felt unpredictable. They saw communication that didn't always align cleanly with expectations built before games. And that difference in perception created a widening gap between two very different understandings of the same situation. Then the reaction ecosystem took over. Sports commentators began breaking down press conference clips, focusing less on what was said and more on how often explanations seemed to change depending on the situation. Podcast discussions, reaction videos, and fan analysis threads all started repeating similar themes. Clarity is missing, timing feels off. Communication could be better. This keeps changing. Even when individual statements weren't contradictory in a strict sense, the sequence of updates created enough perceived inconsistency for debate to grow. And debate is fuel. Once it starts, it doesn't need new information to continue. It only needs repetition. Meanwhile, the team's performance in the game without Caitlin Clark added another layer to the conversation. The Indiana Fever's win was immediately used by some viewers as a talking point, not because of the opponent, but because of what it symbolized in the debate. One group argued, "Twellifer, the team can still win without her. This proves depth matters." Another group responded, "Tlaux. The opponent wasn't strong enough to draw conclusions from that win, so even the same result created two completely different narratives. And both sides felt justified. That's what makes situations like this so volatile. Outcomes don't resolve the debate, they reinforce it. Then came the fan reaction wave. Across social media platforms, posts from attendees and viewers added emotional weight to the discussion. Some expressed frustration about late updates and uncertainty. Others defended the organization, emphasizing that professional sports often involve last-minute medical decisions that cannot always be communicated earlier. But emotionally, the strongest reactions came from expectation mismatch. Fans who planned around seeing a specific player felt the impact most directly, not necessarily because of disagreement with the decision, but because of timing and anticipation. And that emotional layer intensified the conversation further. At the same time, industry voices added their own commentary. Former players, analysts, and media personalities weighed in with varying degrees of caution. Some emphasize that load management for high-usage players is standard practice in modern basketball. Others highlighted that communication consistency is just as important as the decisions themselves when it comes to maintaining trust with fans. But even expert commentary didn't stabilize the narrative, because at this stage, the discussion was no longer about expertise. It was about interpretation, and interpretation is inherently subjective. Meanwhile, online platforms amplified everything simultaneously. Clips of press conferences, stat breakdowns, and reaction videos circulated rapidly, often stripped of full context. A single sentence about stiffness or monitoring could be replayed hundreds of times, each time framed slightly differently, depending on the creator's angle. And that repetition reinforced emotional certainty among viewers. The more something is repeated, the more it starts to feel established, even without new facts. That's how the reaction cycle sustains itself. By the end of this phase, 3 distinct camps had formed. One camp believed this was standard sports management being overanalyzed. One camp believed communication around the situation was inconsistent and confusing. And one camp believed the situation was evolving in a way that raised broader questions about decision-making and player usage. None of these camps fully agreed with each other. And none of them were slowing down, because the core issue was no longer just Caitlin Clark's availability. It had become something bigger. Tyler found how modern sports narratives are formed, fragmented, and amplified in real time. And as long as those narratives keep generating uncertainty, reaction cycles like this don't settle. They evolve into the next layer of the story. Just when it looked like the conversation might settle into routine post-game debate, the narrative shifted again, and this time, it wasn't driven by a new game or a fresh injury update. It was driven by interpretation of everything that had already happened. Because once a story sign reaches this level of attention, fans stop reacting to individual events and start building a connected timeline in their minds. And that's exactly what began happening here. Clips from earlier games were resurfaced again, not as highlights, but as reference points. Minute distributions, substitution timing, sideline reactions, and even brief press conference answers were being stitched together into a broader narrative thread. And once that stitching begins, every moment starts to feel connected, whether it truly is or not. That's where the final twist in perception formed. Twaddle-thruck. The conversation was no longer just about whether Caitlin Clark was available or unavailable in a single game. Twalafrucket had evolved into a belief that there was an ongoing management pattern that fans were trying to decode in real time. Now, it's important to be clear. None of this came from an official statement confirming any hidden structure or disciplinary system. There was no verified announcement suggesting internal conflict or coordinated decision-making beyond standard roster management. But the internet doesn't wait for confirmation before building narratives. It builds them from patterns, timing, and emotion. And right now, all 3 are in play. What made this moment different was how quickly every new update began feeding into the same interpretation loop. A late injury announcement wasn't just an announcement anymore. It was seen through the lens of timing sensitivity. A press conference answer wasn't just a quote. It was compared against previous statements. A substitution pattern wasn't just coaching strategy. It was examined for consistency across games. And the more this happened, the stronger the perception became that something larger was unfolding underneath the surface. Even though, from an organizational standpoint, many of these decisions can still be explained through standard sports logic, injury caution, workload monitoring, matchup strategy, the public interpretation layer had already separated itself from that simplicity. And once that separation happens, The story becomes self-sustaining. Then came the emotional peak of the entire discussion cycle. Fans began shifting the conversation from what happened to why does this keep feeling unclear. That shift matters more than anything else in viral sports narratives, because it moves the debate away from facts and into trust. And trust is far harder to stabilize once it becomes the focus. At the same time, reaction content continued multiplying across platforms. Every new video added another angle, another breakdown, another interpretation of the same sequence of events. Some emphasized caution and normalcy in player management. Others emphasized inconsistency in communication timing. And both sides continued to gain engagement because disagreement drives attention. Meanwhile, fans, revisiting earlier statements, started noticing differences in tone and phrasing across different moments of the season. Even when those differences were minor or context-dependent, they became part of the larger interpretive framework being built online. And that framework now has momentum of its own. Because once a narrative reaches this stage, it no longer needs new evidence to continue growing. It only needs reinforcement, and reinforcement is exactly what repeated discussion provides. So now the situation sits in a very specific place. Not confirmed controversy, not resolved explanation, but an active narrative ecosystem where interpretation is constantly evolving faster than clarification can catch up. And that is what keeps it alive. Because every new game brings new minutes, new rotations, new quotes, and new reactions, all of which get added back into the same ongoing conversation. And as long as that loop continues, one question remains at the center of everything. Law, is this simply standard sports management being heavily scrutinized? Or is it something that only feels complicated because of how close it is being watched? And until that question gets a clear, unified answer that satisfies the public conversation, this story isn't ending. It's just waiting for the next moment to start all over again. And that's where things stand right now. Right in the middle of a conversation that refuses to settle. Because no matter how many explanations get offered, how many clips get reviewed, or how many press conference quotes get replayed, the same core question keeps coming back again and again. Fluff, is this just normal injury management being heavily analyzed under a spotlight? Or is there something about the communication and timing that's making everything feel more complicated than it should be? And that's exactly where the audience comes in. Because this isn't just a situation being watched anymore. It's a situation being interpreted in real time by fans, analysts, and casual viewers, all trying to make sense of the same set of events from completely different angles. Some people see routine caution. Some people see inconsistency. Some people see overreaction. And some people see patterns that they believe are worth paying attention to. So now the question isn't just about what happened on the court. It's about how you personally read it. Do you think this is standard load management in a physically demanding season, where decisions naturally shift based on daily health updates and game conditions? Or do you think the timing of updates, rotation changes, and communication style is what's actually driving all the controversy? And if you do feel there's more to it, Loth, what specific moment made you start questioning the narrative? Because that's the part that really defines this entire discussion. Everyone has a different turning point, where things stopped feeling simple and started feeling unclear. And that's why this conversation is spreading the way it is. Not because there's one agreed answer, but because there are multiple interpretations competing at the same time. And while the debate continues online, one thing is guaranteed. Every new game, every new update, and every new press conference will be watched even more closely than the last. So, if you've been following this situation, stay tuned, because the next development, whatever it is, will almost certainly add another layer to a story that is already far from finished. And when that next moment arrives, the conversation is going to start all over again.